Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. Climate change could cost India 2.8% of the GDP and depress living standards of nearly half of its population by 2050, as average annual temperatures are expected to rise by 1 to 2% over 3 decades, a World Bank report said. If no measures are taken, average temperatures in India are predicted to increase by 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, said the World Bank report titled South Asia's Hotspots, the Impact of Temperature and Precipitation Changes on Living Standards. Even if the preventive measures are taken along the lines of those recommended by the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015, India's average annual temperatures are expected to rise by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. About 600 million people, or 60 crore Indians, today live in locations that could either become moderate or severe hotspots of climate change by 2050 under a business-as-usual scenario. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the risks associated with climate change. Joining me on the program today are Nitin Desai, former Deputy Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development; Vijeta Ratani, Program Manager, Climate Division, Center for Science and Environment; Professor C.K. Varshney, former Dean, Environmental Sciences, JNU; and Dr. Fayaz Khudsar, scientist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What do you make of the World Bank report on climate change?
I would welcome it because I think basically it is focusing attention on something very crucial. When we wrote the Brundtland report, we defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. What this report is saying is the path that we are following now is clearly violating the second part of that definition. That we are doing things which are going to be a problem for the generation to come. That when in 2050, there'll be, depending on if you take the carbon intensive scenario, then about 800 million Indians will be living in hotspots with a decline in living standards of up 8% or more. And even if we follow and the world follows the climate agenda as outlined in the Paris Agreement, even then we are looking at nearly 400 million Indians will be affected in terms of the living standards. So I think why I welcome this report is because it is concretizing the price that we are expecting future generations to pay for our current neglect. And it's very important to emphasize this because everybody focuses on the cost today. They say, today, this is what it's going to cost us if we have to take these steps. But the real question is, you are passing these costs on to others. My second point that I would make is that, yes, they're focused on South Asia, and they have certainly outlined certain measures that need to be taken, particularly on adaptation. Because even if the Paris Agreement is implemented, we'll have to cope with change. I would stress that we should also recognize that this is a global problem. There is very little that we can do unilaterally to stop this happening.
Indeed.
And therefore, along with what we need to do at the ground level, we must also have a diplomatic strategy for making sure that the world as a whole also acts in a certain direction. Because it's not one or the other, it has to be both.
Sure. Professor Varshney, we had the Paris Climate Accord, of course, in 2015, but are the countries of the world taking it seriously, really? And if they are not, why so?
I think the Paris Agreement has outlined that 2 degrees is the one which is beyond that is unacceptable. And they were really looking forward that people and the world government will commit and will do more to keep the global average rise in temperature to 1.5. But let me tell you that the agreement is fine, but I think people are trying to wriggle out. US, one of the largest emitter of the carbon dioxide in the past, largely responsible for the kind of conditions that we are in today, is already come out. The others are sitting on the fence. And I think they are also trying to wriggle out of this agreement and their commitment. So I think the Paris Agreement is fine, but I think implementation is very poor and the commitment seems to be really fading away. But we have to be very careful that unless we look into this very seriously, we have to go beyond Paris Agreement in order to save the lifestyle and the livelihood of the people. Otherwise, it is going to affect every facet of their life. Sometimes these reports say that 400 million people or 800 million people. I think, to my mind, it is a very, very compromising statement. When 800 million people are affected, it affects the entire global economy. It is not 800 million people is a large number, and their needs and their priorities, when they change, I think it changes the whole economics of the world and the economic scenario. So I think it is not only important that these people are going to be affected directly, but fact of the matter is the entire commerce and entire political scenario is going to change because of this kind of a stress that people are going to suffer. One more thing that I would like to say, that even if the Paris Agreement commitments which countries have made are really adhered to, even then it is not going to be a very satisfactory situation, because when we say average temperature is going to be 1.5, the polar temperature is going to be about 7 degrees higher, which is going to be very, very serious for the global economy as well as for the hydrological cycle. In India, we are largely dependent on the rainfall, and rainfall is the first victim of the climate change. So I think the stakes are very high, and we are one of the countries which are going to suffer the most because of the action of our other governments and the past actions. So we have to be very careful.
The country that is going to suffer the most is what Professor Varshney is saying. It is a serious threat as far as climate change is concerned. But how serious a threat is it really, Dr. Kutsar?
It's a very serious. When you look at the level of carbon footprint we are indulging with, the hydrological cycle is the most important point. And why India will suffer? Because we are data deficient country, a country who has no data. We have not collected any basic data. When you look at the changes taking place in flowering, fruiting of plant, even nesting of birds, we are not taking any single data that we predict that something happening. And which are the sectors where we need to play more harder? Which are the sector where we intervene more, greatly? But unfortunately, we are not collecting data. So first and foremost thing, what we need is, we need to collect more and more data. A, B, sir is rightly said that the way we are looking for a term that is development without looking at the quality of life, unfortunately. And in recent trend, when you see in place like Delhi, when people themselves started shouting against the government that why you are cutting trees. These are small things which has bigger impact when you are facing climate change. Yeah.
Sure. Let me now bring into the picture Vijeta Ratani, of course. As far as climate change is concerned, Vijeta, are we taking the problem seriously?
Can I first pitch quickly on the Paris Agreement, and
Indeed.
I will then come to your question?
Sure.
If you look at the Paris Agreement, although it is hailed as a very big achievement of multilateral diplomacy, the character of the regime is that it's a voluntary regime where countries are free to choose what they want to do, not based on the kind of damage that they have done to the environment, but based on their just free will. So US and the developed countries which have been responsible for climate change are unfortunately not held liable to address it. So the onus falls on developing countries like India, who are the worst victims of climate change, and reports every year by Maplecroft, by German Watch, if you see, it all puts India in the top 5, top 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change. That's a very serious thing. The second point that I want to make is that climate change is not a future problem. Of course, the problem is going to increase, it's going to accentuate more, but it is already happening. In India, for example, 86 mm of rainfall has been reduced in the last 3 decades due to climate impacts, due to global warming. And in the future, this is one very small example to prove that a lot of it is already happening, and we being agriculture-prone country, 22% impacts of agriculture are felt in agriculture sector, of climate change are felt in agriculture sector, which is the worst impacted sector. Now coming back to your question on solution, no, we are not a very sensitive country when it comes to addressing climate change. Adaptation, which implies coping with climate impacts, is still to be mainstreamed in our development plans, because climate change erodes development gains. That is very important to understand. So as climate change impacts increases, our development gains are also eroded. So we have to take cognizance of this fact and integrate our development with climate sensitive technologies towards a low carbon future.
Sure.
Unfortunately, at this point, the urgency is not very high in the Indian political circle, but that has to increase. There's no choice.
Okay, we need to speed up our efforts as far as climate change is concerned and do something about it at the earliest is what Vijeta Ratani is suggesting. I'm going to go back to a point that Professor Vashni was making in his opening comment, Mr. Desai, you know, the economics of climate change really and how much of an impact it has on the economy. The World Bank says that climate change is going to have an almost 3% impact on India's GDP by 2050. So what is the economic impact of climate change?
Yeah, basically the impact that you will see of temperature increases will come in many different forms. Let me just quickly mention one thing. We tend to focus on temperature increase, but more and more what people are worried about is instability. No, for instance, you may get more rain on fewer days. So the instability of climate, the incidence of extreme heat events will go up. And it was also very interesting when somebody mentioned about local data. I was involved with one NGO which recently did some work in the hills in UP. And it was very interesting that, as Vijita was saying, there is a perception of climate change at the ground level. And invariably, they would say, give the explanation in terms of biological diversity. You know, oh, wo panchi, April में आता था, अब मार्च में आ रहा है. वो झरना, जून तक चलता था, अभी अप्रैल में सूख जाता है. ये फूल अब 2 महीने जल्दी आता है. All of the observations were in terms of natural phenomenon, and they are there. So I think I just wanted to stress that I think we as a country need to do far more work on that dimension. The impact will fall through agriculture and through health. The health impact of what is likely. And third, through the increase in adverse events. Coastal, in coastal zones, flooding, extreme heat events, floods, droughts because of more rain, fewer days, and so on. So what we have to do from adaptation is to see how we can plan for this. Today, we are planning water resource projects on the basis of historical water flow data. But the chances are that the water flow is going to be very different. We are planning ports on the basis of historical data on sea level, etc. The chances are it's going to be very different. If, as Professor Vashni was saying, if polar temperatures go up by 7 degrees, what we're looking at is a sea level rise, which is very different from what even current projections are suggesting. So my suggestion would be that, yes, we need the global action. And we should certainly keep pressurizing the industrial countries to do far more than what they have been doing. I think some positive things are happening on the economic side because of the growing attractiveness of renewable energy, right? Which is, in some ways, low carbon technologies are becoming far more widespread than they used to be in the past. But we still have to do far more, and we should do that. But beyond that, with the country level, I would argue that we should really start looking much more at understanding what is happening at the ground level more, planning more for adaptation for the changes which will take place in terms of extreme temperature events, extreme flood and drought events, extreme coastal events, and the impact that it is likely to have on agricultural productivity and people's health.
Sure. Historical data should not be the yardstick, whereas, we need to look ahead and preempt some of the things that could happen in the future is what Dr. Desai is suggesting. Professor Vashni, the report also says that 60 crore Indians will be affected as a result of climate change, and it will have a direct impact on living standards. What kind of an impact on living standards can we expect as a result of climate change?
I think there are many different kind of things which are going to affect the living standard. First of all, the availability of the water is going to decrease, because higher the temperature, you will find that evaporation will be more, and the nearby ponds and lakes start going to lose more water, and therefore the availability of water will decrease precipitously. And as said and as experienced, that there will be fewer rainfall events, but they are going to be very intense, which means it will not permit enough time for the earth to soak water and recharge our aquifers. But at the same time, since the water is going to come in heavy spells, and therefore the runoff will increase, and when the runoff is increased, the water is going to be muddy, and the fertility of the soil will be carried away from the agriculture field to the farmer's field to the low-lying areas. And if you see the current photo or the pictures which have been there of the flooding, you will find that the entire water is nothing but mud, which is carrying the topsoil and fertility. So I think the soil erosion is going to be one of the very serious effect. And most of the Himalayas has a great incline, and therefore you will find a huge amount of silt is going to be deposited. And if they are deposited in the low-lying and the flat areas, you will find fertility of the soil will go down, and farmers will have very low and poor fertility. Not only that, the nutrient level of the food that they are going to produce in any case is also going to go down. So there are two kinds of effect. First, the quantity of the food production will go down because of the higher temperature, because at that point of time plants are not capable of really harvesting solar energy as much they can when the temperatures are moderate. And secondly, the nutrient availability will go down, and therefore the nutritional quality will go down, and these two things are going to have a direct human effect. The thirdly, higher temperature, human beings do not work very efficiently. This you must have seen yourself, and everybody's experience is this, that when it is hot and high, your creativity goes down, your thinking power goes down, and therefore the creativity and the work and the manual work and the output of the people will go down. Once the output goes down, the national output goes down. So I think it is going to have this kind of effect. The third and the foremost thing is that people are going to be pushed to the below poverty line. We are working very hard to pull them up the poverty line, but at the same time, because of the climate change, in one stroke, a very large population will be pushed down the poverty line. So I think if that is going to happen, it is going to have a direct effect on our production, it is going to have direct effect on our consumption, and it is going to have a direct effect on our health. So I think these are the kind of things. Hygiene is going to be a major problem, because during summer, because of the water shortage, and hygiene is one such thing that many different kind of diseases come, and many people suffer and pay through their life. Indeed. So I think these are the very serious issues which are not very elaborately discussed, but their implication becomes very clear once you try to analyze them in some detail.
Indeed. You know, Dr. Kutsar, let's talk about solutions now and what can be done really as far as this problem is concerned. What needs to be done to deal with this issue?
Actually, first of all, I'd like to say, sir was talking about crop production, etc. As a master's student, I was working on mung bean and wheat. By pumping more carbon dioxide to the plants and looking at its growth pattern, and I have seen that setting of seed delayed largely. Means you have more vegetative propagation, plant would be very big, no seed or less seed or fewer seed. So that is one of the consequences of climate change. When I look at the solution, it's a very difficult to suggest, but what I feel from my experience that India is a country which has still vast river floodplain and huge forest, huge. Unfortunately, the present short-term vision of development need to be stopped, and we need to see that how these forests should not decrease further, and how these floodplain of major 30-35 rivers should be restored in a way that what we have done in Yamuna Biodiversity Park. We need to create more climate resilient structure, and we have experienced last year in winter when everywhere migration, migration was poor.
Climate resilient structure. Now that's something that I'm going to catch hold of. How do we develop that?
Yeah, that we have done actually. That's why I'm giving you an example that in Delhi we have developed Yamuna Biodiversity Park spread over an area of 457 acres. When last year during winter, when there were less migrants, I'm talking about birds from Siberia, Europe and China towards northern part of the country, our park had very good number. Even we rediscovered many new species.
So what was done differently?
Differently means we have reconstructed ecosystem belonging to Yamuna River Basin. So we need to do more such experimentation all along the river and floodplain, and especially when place like Delhi, where you have 7,777 hectares of forest area, which is nothing but Prosopis juliflora, and you have a huge 50 2 kilometers stretch of river Yamuna, if we do something of utilizing techniques of ecological restoration, probably fighting with climate change would be much more easier.
Sure. So climate resilient ecosystem is something that the scientist is suggesting. Let me go across to Vijeta Ratani and see what some of the other solutions to this problem really can be. What short-term measures, I beg your pardon, should be taken, and what should be done in the long run?
That's a good question, because right now, as I pointed before also, that adaptation is not mainstreamed in the Indian development scenario, and that is of urgent importance. Currently, we have the National Action Plan on Climate Change and State Action Plan on Climate Change, but they are not very functional, they are not very effective, and they are just broad, lofty, ideal development goals that the documents talk about. It is not a ready to happen action plans. So that is not something that we can rely on. So at India level, at the top level, we need to rethink that our coping strategy to deal with climate change has not been very effective till now. It has not been very helpful till now, and it cannot go as business as usual. So at global level, while the countries need to ratchet up their ambition, cut more on their fossil fuel consumption, which is not happening, unfortunately, there's also important point that lifestyle patterns need to be re-understood. We cannot blindly ape the Western style of consumption that over the years India has been. That is one point. The second point is that India needs a very comprehensive risk management strategy, which has different components. So it's an entire continuum which has a lot of aspects to it. So while disaster preparedness is very important in terms of early warning systems and better forecasting stations to help vulnerable communities, to warn them of the disaster that is yet to happen. But we also need, so that is better preparedness, but more when an actual disaster does take place, then relief measures is important for the communities, the safety nets, crop insurance and all that can be effective instruments only if the money goes to the poor. But in the long term, as I said, it has to be ingrained in the development scenario of the country.
Sure.
India itself as a developing country cannot wait for the developed countries to act. It has to pool money, it has to pool finances from its own domestic sources and do something with the technology so that it has to, in the long-term scenario, it needs to ingrain and combine development with climate adaptation. That cannot be divorced from one another.
Sure.
So that is the awareness also that it needs to build, and at every level of governance, this has to be ingrained.
Okay, closing comments now from all my guests, starting with you, Dr. Desai. You know, there's only that much that one particular country can do. At the end of the day, it has to be a global effort, a concerted effort.
Yes, it has to be a global effort. It has to be a concerted effort. That must certainly continue. As a former UN man, I would say that. I'm not as pessimistic as people are. And in the sort of many decades, about nearly 3 decades that I've been involved in, I must say more has happened than I was expecting when we started at the Vilak meeting on climate, which was in 1985. So I'd say that let's not be too pessimistic of what can happen at the global level, but that does not absolve us of the responsibility of preparing our people, our economy, our society for what is likely to happen, regardless of how much is done at the global level. Let's be very frank that today prudence requires that we assume that there'll be some slippage on the Paris targets. Prudence requires that. Maybe things will catch up. I don't know. But right now, this is what prudence requires, and we must now make climate impact assessment a necessary part of all major infrastructure, agricultural, and health planning exercises.
You know, Professor Vashni, is it a losing battle that we are waging against the environment, and something needs to be done sooner rather than later?
I think the environment has to be taken more seriously, and I have a prescription which I can summarize in 3 bullet points. Number 1 is parsimony. We have to develop a lifestyle which is not affluent, which is free from consumerism, and we just draw from nature what we need. The second, that we have to have very strong wing in the Ministry of External Affairs or others, where we have got a very strong team, alerted team, well-informed team of climate diplomacy. Because we need action by others. By setting an example, we need also this to be emulated by others. And this cannot happen by your doing alone. You have also at the international level be a little more focal. Our articulation has to be much better, are fortified with data, and to show that how the poor communities in the countryside on the hilly tracks are suffering because of the climate change, which is not of their doing. That is a part which need to be advertised, told, and it has to be so modulated in our policies that it becomes very apparent when we talk at the international level. We have to really develop a altogether rather aggressive policy of climate diplomacy,
sure,
so that others are really encouraged and catalyzed to really look for their commitment and stand for their commitment. And the third thing that I have to say is that we have also to tighten our belt and have very serious propaganda of climate adaptation and making our farmer learn new techniques, new crops, which really require less of resources and are capable of doing much better when the temperatures are high. So the current pattern of agriculture need to be looked at very carefully,
sure,
and our farmer need to be informed, assisted and educated in really changing without undermining its annual income and its profit.
All right, Dr. Kutsar, closing comments from you. The professor was talking about new techniques, new technology. A lot of stress has been given to green technology over the years. How far have we come on that front?
Actually, I would always prefer to speak on biological entity, because that is very important aspect of climate change if it happens. Sir has rightly said that fighting at diplomatic level is very, very important, first and foremost thing. But when you look at the development, there is a paradigm shift in development in our country. If every day you denotify 100 square kilometer of forest, then fighting with climate change is very difficult. So we have to fight internationally, and we have to fight within the country. And fighting against the all odds that we should protect our protected areas, natural heritage, and we respect our river. We should not go closer to the river for any development project. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to fight. And fortunately, nature has given us so much things that we should not become and create oasis in between,
sure,
but we should protect them intact, and probably we would be the best positioned country if climate change happened that way, which I don't see it is coming very closer to us.
Right. Closing comments from you, Vijeta Ratani. A very quick closing comment. Of course, you've been time and again stressing about the need of how we need to change our mindset as far as climate change is concerned. What's it going to take for us to change our mind about the way we think about the environment?
I think it's already changing. It's already changing with the kind of impacts that we are facing. I think Indian farmer is the most adaptable creature to climate change, because he knows the best way forward, and he's the worst victim to climate change. But my closing remark would be that climate efforts cannot be restricted to Paris Agreement alone, and all countries, developed or developing, we have to drastically ratchet up our ambition when it comes to addressing climate goals. While that has to happen at the global level, nationally we cannot be mute spectators of the onslaught of climate change, where now freak is the new normal. The freak events are the new normal now in the Indian scenario, as we witness it every month, every week. So that urgency has to come in, that urgency of adapting to climate change, and that alarmist tendency has to be there, because
sure,
we cannot just sit and see and be witness to the impacts of climate change, because we all have the basic right to clean environment, to good food, to good water quality.
All right.
So
on that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.